So welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Rob Love. I'll be the host of the webinar today, and really pleased to have Diane Burfeindt and Tad Melton with us here today to talk about something that we all feel is really important in senior living today, and that's strategic planning. But first, as they say, let's walk through a couple of logistics things for today. The way we do our webinars is that we'll run through the content first. Our goal is to get through all of that by 1 o'clock, but you're welcome to ask questions at any point along the way. And in your, as you see in the image here, there should be a Q&A dialog box in your Zoom webinar screen, and you can just click on that, and you'll be able to type your questions in. And when we get through, close to about 1 o'clock and wrap up the main content, we'll move forward with the Q&A at that point. But do please use the Q&A function and not the chat function, which is a separate control box for the questions, as that helps us keep track of what's been answered and what has not yet. So today we're going to talk a good bit about strategic planning, including the need for developing really effective and innovative and different strategic plans from the kinds that we've had in the past. We're going to explore some of the opportunities that organizations are, can, or should be exploring during that process. And affiliation is something, I won't steal the thunder of our presenters, but I know that people maybe aren't looking at it as positively as they can. Think of it more as maybe a last-ditch resort rather than a positive opportunity for organizations. So we're going to spend some time on that as well. And then wrap up with, if you're really looking to start the strategic planning process, what's the kind of information you need to have to prepare your board effectively for that process? So that's our goal for today. With that, I'd like to take just a minute and ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Tad, could you go first?
Great. Thanks, Rob. I'm Tad Melton. I'm a managing director with Ziegler in our Richmond, Virginia office, and the team that I work on manages our activities in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast. And I've been with the Ziegler about 12 years and have been in the field of senior living investment banking 26 years. Diane?
Hello, I'm Diane Burfeindt. I'm managing principal for Trilogy Connect. Some of you may recognize the name of the company, as I took over for Scott Townsley as he retired, and he was a consultant in the field for a long time. My area of practice really is focusing on working with boards and leadership on strategy, strategic relationships, and as we'll talk about today, decision making as well. So my background, I have 25 years as an operator in the field in just about every level of aging services that there is. So I kind of meshed that together with working with boards on strategy. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks, Tad. And as we always do, I just want to say I really appreciate Diane, Tad, and all the people that join us for these webinars, where it's not their day job to be doing this. And they spend a lot of time working with us to prepare the content, help with blogs and things. So it's a commitment of Tad and Diane's time to be here today and share their thoughts with you. And we really appreciate you being willing to share your thoughts with the field. So with that, let's look into setting the stage for just why strategic planning is so important. And for those of you that may be regular follows of our webinar series, I'm going to share some things I share fairly regularly as part of these discussions. I'll just hit them much more quickly today than I typically might. Just we are in a rapidly evolving, highly competitive environment, the life planning communities, and not just because of other life planning communities, but of so many other options that aging adults have today. You see several of them right here: rental opportunities, really strong growth in at-home services. Can get most of the services that we used to say come to our communities for. You can get them at a touch of a button on your phone now. Active adult technology, they are all taking aim at this market that we've been serving for a long time and looking to provide alternatives. So how do we compete effectively and how do we differentiate ourselves is a really critical question for the future. And of course, you step back and look at operational types of challenges. And I hope there are some of you out there that are going, oh, yeah, we got this under control. But most organizations I talk with, they're still really struggling from labor challenges. And there aren't a lot of positive signs for some mysterious pool of employees to suddenly come up out of nowhere. So, from a strategic planning perspective, really looking at how can we deliver services appropriately in the future is a huge challenge. And, I know our panelists will talk a little bit about that as we go. And certainly we take all these things together, inflation, pressures on how much can you push up monthly fees and entrance fees, continuing reimbursement challenges. That's been a theme as long as I've been in senior living. There's just really pressed margins. So again, a need to step back and say, how can we look at what we do differently in a way to really make sure we have healthy, successful businesses well into the future? And it's not all doom and gloom either. We all know that there is a very large increase in the market that we traditionally serve coming up as the boomers age. And not only that, but this was data from this. It's interesting that this study focused on the forgotten middle, as it says on the bottom in the footer, housing and care options for middle income seniors in 2033, yet the highest proportion of the age 75 and older population is actually in the high income group, as defined by this as those who have annual income from all their assets of $100,000 or more a year. So there's pretty significant growth in that segment of the market that we have traditionally served. And there's a lot of potential for our organizations to grow into the future. But a challenge with all these pressures around us today is we wind up spending so much time on the day-to-day. How do we get through this? How do we get through that challenge? That it makes it hard sometimes for us to step back and really re-envision what our communities can be. And that's the challenge ahead for all of us. And Diane and Tad will talk much more about that. So before we launch into our specific topics here, I'd just like to ask each of them to summarize kind of from that macro view, what are you seeing as some of the big challenges and issues that both are feeding into the need for strategic planning and possibly making it difficult to do it? Diane?
Yeah, Rob, when I listen, and obviously we've talked a lot about this, and I just think about here we are, pandemic year number 3, or however you want to categorize it. But it was a game changer. And I think, as my first point mentioned, CEOs really are struggling with how to engage their boards. And I think I hear a lot of people talking about boards have changed, and certainly the way we interact has changed. I don't think anybody would have thought of doing a virtual board meeting before the pandemic. And now it's hard to get boards back in action in person. So I think it's also, how do we help boards understand what's happening and how do we communicate that to them? I think also, as you mentioned before, I really see partnerships being viewed with a new lens. It's an opportunity to be successful. And Tad and I will talk a little bit about that today, but how do you look at it as what I think it is, which is probably the path forward in this field itself, much like other industries. It is the normal way of doing business. And so I think that's something as well. Certainly burnout, with the after effects of the pandemic, with the staff, but also leadership. I see it across the board. As you mentioned, people it's hard enough to get past the everyday and the challenges of every day and waiting for that next shoe to drop. And to think about stepping back and thinking about strategy is sometimes a really big hill to climb. And then I think a lot about, just as you mentioned with your last slide, that missed opportunity to engage with the broader aging services ecosystem. There's lots of people looking to get into aging services space, and there's lots of technology out there. There's ways in which we could be connecting and leveraging our skill set of really coordination and education. That's what I see out there.
Right, great, thank you. And Tad, from your perspective.
Yeah, Rob, it's been interesting the last few years as I think about that in preparation for today's conversation. Our topic is the transformational period that we think that we're in, and the need for kind of a contemporary approach to strategic planning. As I thought about all of that, it's been our sense for some time that there's a shift occurring, and it's been a challenge at times to put our finger on that as to what's going on. But most organizations, most life plan communities are doing reasonably well when it comes to occupancy. But what we're finding is that the higher operating expenses over the last few years, and it started with the COVID expenses and has increased with this general inflation, is straining people's budgets. And it's particularly impacting folks who made significant investments in replacement nursing facilities in recent years under a somewhat different set of economic circumstances. So they took on debt and additional capital obligations. And the period in which they kind of underwrote that was one of less operating expenses. We're finding the standalone skilled nursing facilities, not the life plan communities, are really struggling. I think we're going to see a bit of a day of reckoning in that segment of the senior living industry going forward. And so, traditionally, the way that we've grown as an industry, or I should say the way we built more capital capacity to make the investments that we need to make, are by growing our revenues and expanding with independent living. But that's even a challenge itself these days with the cost of construction and higher interest rates. The old playbook of building more independent living to be able to create the capital capacity to make these broader investments is not as fruitful as it used to be. And so that is a real strategic challenge, because life plan communities have to grow over the long haul, and an inability to grow in the traditional sense is going to be tough. So that's leading to really the greatest number of affiliation conversations I've seen in my career. And all of this supports the need for strategic planning, because if your board is not aware of what's going on and you're not thinking about your strategies and how it fits into these prevailing trends, it's going to be tough to react to them. And volunteers just aren't going to get there themselves. It's going to fall on the executives of our organizations to bring their boards along. So that's what I'm seeing, and I'm excited to talk more about different aspects of this today with you and Diane.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move into kind of three major topic areas. There's three major organizations of things today. And the first is going to be a broader look at the need for strategic planning, and really kind of how we think about how do we prepare the board for that, and are our boards prepared for that. Now, before we jump in, just want to say for everyone joining us today, for the majority of this, we don't really have a presentation. This is a dialogue. This is a conversation, between Diane and Tad and myself, sharing a lot of thoughts. So with your Zoom controls at home, you may want to make the presentation screen smaller. We're just going to keep the macro question up here so everybody can remember what's the basic topic that we're focused on. But if you want to be able to make the images of the speakers larger, that's really where the focus is going to be here on Diane and Tad. So with that, the need for strategic planning, we touched on this a little bit, but Diane, maybe ask you to start off with a little bit, exploring a little bit more, what is keeping, what are the sort of roadblocks that people should have in mind or be aware of that's keeping them, that they need to overcome or get past to really be able to develop long-term, effective strategic plans?
Well, it just struck me as we were talking, I wrote down the word complicated. And I think some people just think that it's complicated. And when you talk about, I mean, I don't know all the words that we've already just used today about an innovative plan, transformative plan. That all sounds like there's a lot of people that don't like strategic planning. So it all sounds difficult and complicated. And I think I hear so often with CEOs and their leadership that the board just doesn't understand. And that's absolutely right. They're not in this business. They're not supposed to be in this business. Otherwise, leadership wouldn't have a job to do. But I think what's happened, in my opinion, over the last several years, and as Tad mentioned, a lot of this has been going on before the pandemic. It's just that it made it more obvious. So it seems like before the pandemic, many times leadership CEO would go to the board and they talk about difficulties, but so many times they talk about them and then there was this bag of tricks. There was this stuff that we did back before the pandemic that seemed to work. And so I don't know whether it covered up some of the issues or it was just cyclical. And so I've found lately that boards just got used to that. They got used to the fact that when we talked about perhaps it being not great, it always somehow magically became great, whether or not it was or not. And so now I see when I talk about it being complicated, I think the issue is that boards don't understand because for the past 3 years, at least the past 2 years, they have really just been in a role of being supportive. As leadership teams figured out what the heck was going on with the pandemic and how to respond to it, boards were honestly, I think, just there to be supportive and help the team through it. And so now they have to get back to being generative as a board. They have to get out of operations. And there has to be, I've found in a lot of circumstances, that line in the sand that says we're moving from this operational pandemic focus to something more strategic. And the first thing I think people have to do is really just take an honest look at what's been going on and help to share that with the board in whatever way is natural. Whether it's, I always advise leadership teams to just kind of do a little SWOT analysis just from their own heads. What's going well, what's not, what are the threats? It's those simple things that gives board insight. And then we can talk a little bit as we go along here about how do you use that insight to really help move you forward. Because chances are you've got people on your board that are from a lot of different industries that really could provide some insight into what we're going through now. And we'll talk a little bit later about, some of those examples. So Ted, I don't know if that sparked any thoughts on your side.
Yeah, it does. It's interesting. I mean, it seems like I agree with you that the last few years have almost been more tactical than strategic in a lot of cases where organizations responding to COVID and all of these financial pressures. And so it is a time to turn to have a more strategic approach. It's interesting to me too. I mean, there's a board that I've worked with or part of an organization for almost 20 years now. And I was making a strategic trends presentation to them in the last year or two. And there was a gentleman who had been on there who I've gotten to be friends with all of that time. And when I was breaking down the basic financial economics of life plan communities and what's necessary to really thrive and be successful, he was kind of stunned. And it just shocked me. And he was stunned in the sense that there were some fundamental things he just didn't know. And this is a person who had been on a board for 20 years. And so if we're going to go through this reset and take an honest look at where we are, leaders are going to have to continue to educate and bring their board members along. And so I'm seeing that need myself.
All right. So I think that is a good segue to the next part of this. What role should the board play in strategic planning? Is strategic planning an executive team function? Is it a board function? Is it joint? I know, Diane, you lead a lot of us. Maybe talk about what that CEO leadership board relationship really ideally should look like and what role that board should play in strategic planning.
Yeah, I think it also gets to the definition of strategic planning. I think I've seen the entire spectrum. I do believe that it's one of the roles of the board is to lead strategic planning and develop a strategic framework. But I know if you're in the mindset where your strategic plan is a little bit more operational, then that doesn't sound right. So I think what we're saying today is that we want a board that's really out there looking at, I made the last 2 days I've been using this phrase that I've been talking with a couple of affiliation partners about that they brought up. The board is here well past any of the staff. That is their role. And individual board members might not be here well past the CEO or the leadership team, but the board is here well beyond any staff members. And I think when the board puts that hat on, I think it starts to help them understand the challenging role that they have to play, because as much as leadership is going to be invested in the organization and its success, there is a limit to their viewpoint. And so I think helping boards understand their fiduciary responsibility and just in a nuts and bolts sort of way, their responsibility to ensure that the organization's mission continues, that really starts to think about strategy then. And so I talked a little bit about, so you asked about the role of the volunteer board. I talked a little bit about insight. So I think the role of the board is really to be there to ask the challenging questions and to bring forth, I tell every board I work with, you are there because of your individual perspective. You are there because of your lived experience. You're there because of your professional role. Maybe you had a family member, loved one, maybe you work there, whatever it is, that's what you're bringing to the table. And so what I see that relationship being between the CEO and a board is a very collaborative relationship where the CEO has to be a little vulnerable, which I think is hard too. When you're in a position when you're always wanting to make sure the board knows you're successful, I think being vulnerable is hard. But I think if you bring forward to the board the insight from the leadership team, this kind of quick SWOT analysis. I always ask leaders to take a look at your existing strategic plan, operational plan, whatever it is, and see what are those things you're not getting done? What are those things you've had on your plan for 10 years and you've never been able to make a dent? Those are things that you need to bring forward to the board. And then you need to engage them in a way where they're able to bring their perspective from their lived experience to the table and help the board ask those challenging questions. I think the last thing I'll say on that is just, I hear so many times as well that boards offer a lot of suggestions and solutions. And I think that's very normal. A group of people want to help. And especially as we're coming out of COVID, they want to help, they want to provide solutions. So a big piece of this is setting up these conversations in ways in which they're providing you insight and perspective. And I always remind them as well, most of the people on a board are age and income qualified, be a part of our services. And so they're not designing for somebody else. They're designing for them and what they want. And that's really, I think, what we're trying to get that relationship to be.
Right. And Ted, I know you've shared some thoughts on this. I'd like you to share it with the people with us today. That the part of this question that are boards prepared to develop effective plans? And you just shared a story of a 20-year board member who didn't have the financial literacy to really understand the economics of a life plan community. And, I've worked with a large number of boards through the years, as I know each of you has. And I would just like your perspective, because I've really started to wonder, is it time for our field to consider shifting away from the volunteer board to a paid board, where I hear a lot of boards struggling to, or a lot of CEOs struggling to recruit strong board members? And is there a rationale for really shifting to a paid board where we can recruit the expertise we need to guide us in strategy? I don't know. Curious, what have you seen and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Rob, and I know you and I have spoken about this some previously. I work with a few boards that are paid, and I checked. We keep a database, a proprietary database of the paid boards across the industry, and it's not that many, candidly, as a component of our larger field, maybe a couple dozen within the whole field. But it's interesting because the paid boards that I work with, they're smaller and more focused, and the board members' depth of knowledge, attention to detail, and preparedness is at a different level. I mean, it's frankly more impressive than the general volunteer board. Now, I'll say that in many of the volunteer boards, they tend to be larger. And there's almost always a subset of the board. It could be if 4 to 6 to 8 people, something, just making that up, but that provide that function. They're more engaged. And they rise to the occasion a little more than others. And so it's an interesting thing to think about, whether compensating board members or moving to smaller boards, or what some different strategies could be to increase the attentiveness and the leadership that we get from the boards. But I'll say that even those paid boards, those that distinguish themselves, their executive is an integral part of creating the vision and leading them there. And so it's really, it does fall on we're talking a lot about board members and board engagement today. But I have to say, in my experience, if the CEO doesn't make it a priority to engage the board and provide the vision and give them the perspective, it's really challenging for the board to get there.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Tad. And I would just go along with that by saying, if you just decide it's the board that's the problem, and you may be paying the board, I think you're just going to end up paying people to act the same way. Right. So I think it's an absolute shift. So many people say, I need new board members, they don't pay attention, whatever. And I always put myself in the board member's seat. Do you want to sit on a board where you're just like, you don't understand things and you're nodding your head? And no, you want to be on a board that's exciting and engaging, where you feel like you're contributing. So I think you're right. Smaller boards, paid boards, whatever. I think it has to be an intentional focus.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, let's start to shift into exploring a little bit more of the strategic opportunities that are or could be available to organizations. And Diane, I know you shared several examples, and I'd like to ask you to share that with our listeners today. What do you feel we can learn from other fields or industries that have had to go through really substantial transformative change? What can we learn from that and adapt from that?
So I always like to use analogies. I like to go back and look now, what do we know about something now that probably didn't know as they were going through it? And I find this is a really great opportunity to use examples like this with your board to say, we're going through this. What have you seen in your own professional life? So many times I'm sitting at a board and, if you have anybody from banking, for instance, they'll talk about, the changes that have gone through in banking. But one of the examples I like to use, very different than what we're talking about here, but when you talk about transformation, and this example really helps people to think through what you know now to be the reality was not the reality before. And so the recording industry is actually one I think a lot about. Because when I was growing up, and you would go to the store and get a record, and the recording industry was a big old place. It was a big system that generated music, and it might not have had a lot of choice to it. Very structural, very expensive, and again, I think we can think analogy to senior living in some respects. And when streaming came out, when Napster first started doing streaming, they actually sued them. And they said, there's no way this can happen. There is no way that people will be allowed just to use all this music for free. And so where are we today? And I think, as I think about that too, I think as they thought about when you're selling a song for 99 cents, how do we get to the revenue that we're seeing now? Well, when you have, I think we've surpassed now 1 trillion downloads, that adds up pretty fast. So when we think about the transformation of our industry, and we think about perhaps the structures we have and the infrastructure that we have, and we think, well, how could we make it work on a technology basis or whatnot? That's an example that I like to use, and really to start to engage boards in thinking about that. The other one, real quickly, that's a lot closer to home is hospitals. And I think we've seen, when I look at hospital systems, and some of my background is in hospital work, I see that today consolidation is the norm. And whether you like it or you don't like it, and there's some that have been more successful than others, I think you see that the ones that have tried to go it alone are really in a difficult situation. Hospitals are faced with some of the same things that we're seeing now. And so there's another reason I like to use analogies, because it starts to tell you, when we talk about an inflection point, and Tad, you talked about the fact that you feel something changing and it's hard to grasp. You take a look at hospitals, and they were faced with overwhelming cost increases. If you think about the cost of a CAT scan or an MRI machine, huge investment. And they were faced with the same thing some of our skilled nursing units are faced with. Managed care organizations, Medicare, commercial payers, were all ratcheting down payments. So the only way for them to see a future that was brighter was to say, we need the scale to be able not only to invest the capital that's needed, but to have the leverage to push back on some of these revenue issues as well. I think skilled nursing is in that place. And I think generally senior living, I think we can find a lot of consistency with where we're at.
Yeah, at least we're in a field that has growing demographics.
Yeah.
I mean, Rob showed, not only are our demographics growing, Rob showed a graph earlier. We take a lot of questions often about, are people going to be able to afford? They hear that people haven't saved that much. Are people going to be able to afford life plan communities in the future? And the data that Rob shares shows that that segment is actually growing. I've had the privilege of being on the board of trustees of my alma mater, my college, which is a small school in Virginia, for 7 years now. And you talk about a depressing situation. The demographics of college age students, there are fewer and fewer of those today. And so those institutions are facing equally as tough inflation, and with declining demographics and little pricing power. And so I do think we can learn a lot about how other industries have grown and transformed themselves, kind of on the one hand, healthcare and the recording industry, and on the other hand, some of these others, and think about, as we plot our strategies, where we want to be, because it's a challenging circumstance in that regard.
Yeah. So Tad, what are some of the most significant growth opportunities that you see for senior living organizations? Like the ones you work with a ton of organizations throughout this region, and certainly Ziegler does. What are the most significant growth opportunities, maybe even non-traditional or something, that that you're really seeing organizations push forward with?
So I would characterize those into two categories, or categorize those, I guess I should say, Rob. Leading Age North Carolina, for those any North Carolina folks on the call today, commissioned an economic impact study about 7 years ago as part of their lobbying efforts. And what they learned, as a sidebar to that, is that just based on the growing senior demographics in North Carolina alone, if they wanted to maintain the same penetration rates, same market share, they would have to double the number of residential senior living communities just to maintain the same penetration rates. It's pretty stunning. And so the for-profit sector is rising to the occasion, if you will, a bit more. Most of the new communities in the states that I work in are from for-profits. So So when we talk about growth opportunities, there's a significant opportunity to serve more people. And in most of the life plan communities where we work with have solid to strong occupancy in independent living. Those that are landlocked may find it more challenging. And the economics of adding independent living are more challenging than they have been. But so there, as you talk about growth opportunities, the lowest hanging fruit, if you have the land to do it, and in most local markets, is adding independent living. The other two that are somewhat, it's hard to say non-traditional, but they really kind of fall in that category, are joint ventures for certain types of technological ventures, or some of the at-home non-residential services. And then affiliation. It's interesting. We keep this leading age Ziegler 200 database of the 200 largest systems. And in the last 10 years, those systems started experiencing more growth for themselves, more growth from affiliation than they did from constructing new units. And I know that there's been a lot of talk about affiliation for years in our industry. But there's that old saying, it was all gradual and then suddenly at once. And I'm increasingly of the opinion we're pretty close to the suddenly at once, just based on the number of conversations of executives calling me on their own and asking more about how they develop the strategies they need to develop. So
Yeah.
those are some of the things we're looking at.
Yeah, and I think there's a great example of that, not necessarily affiliation, but partnership, which is part of the discussion right in your backyard. We had on our December webinar, Jonathan Cook of Lifespire, Virginia, and he was sharing just a little bit of information about the partnership that they have with Pinnacle, another multi-site, not-for-profit organization. I think their headquarters of both are probably within a mile or so of each other. And they've developed partnerships for home health, looking at doing pharmacy, a lot of things where they bring together that economy of scale. Between them, they probably got 10 or more communities. And it really opens up opportunities to generate revenue that, most single site communities are having to outsource because they can't manage it themselves because they don't have the scale to do that. So we'll probably touch on that kind of thing a little bit more. But Diane, you mentioned a little bit about technology earlier. I think you're talking about staffing and so forth, and some of the transformations that organizations or other fields have gone through. So share a little bit more of your thoughts on how can or should technology play into strategic planning for our organizations.
I think Tad and I know that we could probably do a whole other session on this.
Yeah.
I really, I'm not sure if concern is a strong enough word, but I'm concerned for nonprofit senior living and the way that we approach technology. As I look at a lot of strategic plans and work with a lot of boards and CEOs, and I'm looking for insight into perhaps things that are harder for the organization to do. Technology is almost always one of those that, we all know that it's a struggle. And when we talk about technology, invariably someone will say, well, I just don't know which fall prevention program to get, or, it's very specifically focused on solving a problem. I reviewed a strategic plan recently, and it stuck out to me so much. At the very bottom of the strategic plan, there was this throwaway that was technology. And it was kind of the way they stated it was kind of like, we'll try to come up with a consumer technology solution. And you could just tell that there was no way they were going to be doing that. They didn't. And so I think that tells you what are those things that perhaps you really need to look at. What expertise do you need in that area? As Tad mentioned, maybe that's a partnership. But the reason I think it's so important is because, again, when we look at the fact that we're consumers of whatever it is aging services is going to give us, and right now we've got strapped to ourselves watches and phones and apps, and I think when you step into senior living, typically you're stepping back 10 to 15 years. Now, maybe it's not that bad anymore, but you're not getting the connectedness that we all expect in our lives. I hear a lot of CEOs lamenting right now about this new type of IL resident that seems to be more demanding. Well, they didn't just instantaneously, sprout out of nowhere. I think we might be seeing some of the impacts of a pandemic that really was very technology oriented in terms of how we got through it. And now you've got these organizations that really, I don't think are transforming in that way. So I'm not suggesting that we go and invest billions of dollars in becoming the next Apple or anything like that. But I think what we learned from the pandemic is residents are able, willing, and ready, and probably past time for wanting these changes. You go in any McDonald's today, and you can go up to the register and order from a human. You can go to a kiosk. You can order from your app. There's all sorts of different ways to do that. And I think lastly, I would just say that there's also, I think, the strength of what senior living brings. We've always brought coordination and education, I think, to consumers. We help to explain things. We help to bring things together. And when you look at the amount of technologies out there, and you can literally Google and it will tell you all sorts of ailments that you have, I think our role may also be as a connector. How do you bring your Apple Watch and your echocardiograms and all of that? How do you bring that to senior living and really help to be the experts that help people with it is perhaps a suggestion.
Right. Thank you. So we've touched on the idea of affiliation and partnerships, kind of throughout our conversations. Let's dive a little deeper into this before we wrap things up in a little bit. And I think one of the biggest things we shared as we were coming together and planning this and discussing this is that there's so many organizations that tend to view the idea of an affiliation as a worst case scenario. I've worked with organizations, as I'm sure each of you have, that the board has basically been, we've been independent for 100 years, we're going to be independent for the next 100 years. And because that perception is, you only need to consider an affiliation if you're going under, or worst case scenario. But I think, you've both mentioned more of a positive approach to this. How would you go about convincing a board or, even an executive team to really think about various types of affiliations as a proactive opportunity? Tad, do you want to kind of lead off with how you overcome that stereotype?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Rob. So I agree that historically we've associated the need to affiliate with somebody who is in a position of financial or strategic weakness and needs a stronger partner. I would also very strongly agree that we're entering into a new phase of the history of this industry where that's not necessarily the case, where organizations are coming together because they can see that the 1 + 1 = 3. And so your specific question, which is an interesting one I have an answer to, is how do you make that clearer to a board? And I've participated in a couple of strategic planning retreats over the past few weeks. So I had agreed to participate in this before those even occurred. And I was sitting in the room, but established the strategic goals of the organization and then said, how are we going to, these were single sites, strong single sites, reputable single sites that everybody would know. And they said, all right, how are we going to accomplish these goals in light of the changing economics of our industry? And the only way, is affiliation. If they can't grow more independent living and create that margin, they said, well, if we were part of a system, we could do that. And so affiliation is not for everybody. Most single sites are very strong and don't need that white knight. But A lot of times when we're planning a project, and Rob, you've been on teams where we've done this together, they say the board's never going to approve a project of that magnitude. And then you study what they really need and what the impact of that can be on them strategically. And everyone has that aha moment and there's consensus. And it's kind of the same with respect to this. And it's rapidly becoming more obvious, I think, when folks say this is where we want our organization to go. And it's just not as easy to get there as it maybe it used to be.
If I can just tack on to that, I think the phrase that I just have been using recently, working with a couple of organizations that are very strong and are looking to come together, they're talking about being able to move the needle. And I think that to me really resonates, because when I see them get excited, it's about what they can accomplish together. Yeah, they'll be fine separately, but what is the definition of that? They're still going to struggle getting staff. They're still going to compete on leadership depth. They're still, I think one of the big things that they're thinking a lot about is as you mentioned before, if we're not careful and we don't start acting now, there is a lot of for-profit building going on and getting in the market sooner than us. So we could be losing traction right now. So these conversations have really been around, what can we do stronger together? And how do we start moving the needle on these things that likely are not going to change? Capital access and things of that nature. And I think that's where the exciting part comes in. I think these early adopters of strong organizations coming together, I think will help to move the needle on the field, really looking at partnership as just kind of a normal thing to do. And I guess one of the things I would say for a board is that this, first of all, is their fiduciary responsibility to see how they can get their strategic goals implemented more efficiently or realistically, to your point. The other thing is it doesn't hurt to talk about it. There's no risk at all to it. And that day when that opportunity comes to you, or you find that opportunity, you're a little bit more prepared to have those conversations.
And Rob, I see a question. If I could
Sure.
jump in and I think because it's perfect in this
Right.
topic area. Dick Wager asks, when we talk about affiliation, what are the types and what percentage of the affiliations are there in each type? And an affiliation, in my mind, is really is a synonym for merger. But it's one in which two nonprofits come together and little to no cash is exchanged. It's not like a proprietor sells their business. And I've got some statistics here. There have been 200 life plan communities that have gone through an affiliation since 2015. This is just some Ziegler information. 39% of those were a campus that was owned by already a system, selling it to another system, not selling, affiliating with another system. 35% of those were single site campuses affiliating into a multi-site. And about 19% of those were closures. And of those closures, 70% of those were skilled nursing facilities. So it's largely, it's about an relatively equal distribution between a single site affiliating into a system and then systems transacting with each other.
And I think while we're on that, well, actually, we're sort of, I think we've morphed into really addressing the next question kind of as we've gone here, how could or should a healthy organization think about this? Either of you, examples come to mind of the healthy organizations coming together proactively? I mean, the one that I think has been foremost in my awareness, but I'm probably missing a bunch, is, Brio and Ohio Living. That there was not, to any of my knowledge, a forced need, these are two strong organizations coming together, one in Michigan and one in Ohio, looking to broaden their strengths.
Yeah, I think
other examples you're aware of?
I always get the name wrong, but isn't it United Church Homes and Hospice? A large hospice organization is coming together, I think, was announced. I think Ohio Living is a great example of probably lots of reasons that they came together. And I think one of the first steps in working with a board on seeing some of that is really talking about why you would want to partner with someone else. Really look at that SWOT analysis, look at where your holes are. If you're primarily a life plan community and you really want to expand into home and community based, and maybe you've tried for a while and haven't done well, maybe that's ripe for looking for a different sort of organization that already knows how to do it. So the organizations that I work with that are strong and are coming together, some of it I think started with management depth issues, leadership depth issues, and being in the same general geographic area, and really struggling with how do we get new leaders in. And so they found, and then the same obviously with staffing. So it started out with a problem that they were looking to solve, but quickly morphed into, well, it's not very inspirational just to get together to solve a problem. What more could we do? And that's where you get into the issues of capital access. And when you come together as two strong organizations, what does that do to the tools that you can use in capital? And I think, Tad, you talk a little bit about that as well, and what that might bring to the table.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's no doubt that two organizations coming together should see enhanced capital capacity, but they are one of the other things that becomes more available or more sophisticated financing tools as a business grows from one campus where the risk is on that campus to multiple campuses as a diversified enterprise. And that one of the larger systems in the country has a line of credit that I think might be $100 million. That a single campus could never get something like that, even if they're strong, really, really strong. But it allows them to make acquisitions and investments very quickly, should they want. And so there are definitely benefits from a capital standpoint as well. And you can always, I mean, it's, you've always been able to make the case that from kind of a corporate finance business school standpoint, if you can lower costs by bringing organizations together and lower overhead and things like that. But I do really adhere to the philosophy that you can move the needle and do more together as well. I mean, there's a lot of talk about trying to serve more of the middle income and lower income. That's not very profitable. And so the ability to do that within an organization that has more market rate communities makes that more achievable. So it'll be exciting to see where those organizations go.
And so my takeaway from all this, just to sort of summarize it, and I'm going to steal some of the words that you've used, Tad, as we've prepared for today, is that what do you want to accomplish as an organization that you just haven't been able to achieve on your own? Diane, you gave an example of maybe you've been trying to go to home and community-based services for the last 10 years and it's just not going anywhere. Tad, you mentioned maybe you want to get into more moderate income housing. Maybe there are IT and technology issues you want to pursue. Maybe you really need a stronger HR component and recruitment process. All these different things that as a single site, it's really challenging to be able to afford to put the organizational structure, management structure behind making them effective. But you join forces and you get that economy of scale, and suddenly you're able to achieve a lot more in areas like that and more.
Yeah, and Rob, and as you segue, I mean, we certainly, Ziegler is a proponent of affiliation. Some of our executives are very outspoken in that, and not everybody's, it's not the answer for everybody. But if you're not, this is about, and as we come to closure here on strategic planning, this is about transformational change in our industry and the need for more strategic planning. And you're not going to be able to identify some of the tactics like affiliating without really rigorous strategic planning.
Yep. All right. And just want to spend a couple minutes on, hopefully those of you that joined us today have joined because this is something you're thinking about, this is something you're trying to prepare for. Maybe you've started, or maybe it's on your goals for the year to get this launched. So what are some of the most common information? We talked a lot about board education. Is the board prepared for this? And so I'm going to share some of this, information needed for strategic planning in light of an experience we had with an organization here in Maryland, starting almost 10 years ago as a new CEO joined the organization. One of the first questions that I think any organization needs to be able to look at it and answer is, are we meeting the market's needs and expectations? What I see in a lot of cases is the board members come to board meetings, they come into the community, they go down to the boardroom, dinner's brought in, they meet and they leave. And they don't really understand their community and what it all offers, not to mention the competition. And so it has been really helpful to be able to do a detailed competitive positioning analysis, coupled often with a pricing analysis, to really enable organizations and boards to understand where are they relative to the market and what do they truly need to do to remain competitive in the future. And this organization that we had worked with, this was the first step we did, was market analysis, competitive analysis, pricing analysis, and you're looking at their residence size mix. And what came out of this was they were the most expensive community in the market. Their product was very dated. The residences were very small. Nursing was highly institutional. Amenities were very outdated and behind the market needs. So a very strong mismatch between price point and the quality of the offering. And when you go in and you look into it that way and explain it, that helped them understand why their census was at 83%. They were not meeting the market needs. What was really interesting as we went through the next several years of planning is board members would bring that study to the meeting and conversation would go in a certain direction and somebody would open it up and say, well, remember in the study, they said this, and we really need to do that. And the educated board really was able to guide the process much more effectively. Certainly other basic steps. Are there opportunities for growth? A market demand analysis will be able to share, is there room in your market to grow on your existing campus or perhaps somewhere else? The same organization several years later came back and they had a very strong initiative. They wanted to be able to better serve the African-American market and ask, how could we help them identify opportunities for that? It's just one example of a niche market. There are many. And we were able to look at the entire, northern Maryland, from Baltimore up area, do a density map, heat density map of the age and income qualified population, overlay it with the density of the African-American population to see where these mutual pockets were that might have the best opportunity, to develop that type of community. A lot of communities are landlocked and don't really have much opportunity to grow, but on their existing site. But could they support a satellite community, or is there opportunity to do a separate community? Again, taking the basic market analysis tools, we were able to look at, we actually went through the entire state of Maryland and did density maps like this of all the different geographic areas, looked at where's the population, where's the competition, and where are unserved areas. And so like you see in the circle, there's pretty high density, but most of the competition is down here around Rockville, Gaithersburg, or up here more around Columbia and Baltimore. So potential, to consider something out there in the middle of Howard County around us. And lastly, there's always that opportunity to ask the market, what do they want? What do they value? What are they looking for that they're not getting? And there are many forms of consumer research, but our favorite is what we call consumer research events, because we're able to bring in relatively large groups, representing maybe 35 to 50 households at a time. You could think of it as like a focus group on steroids. They're highly interactive, so you get all that anecdotal feedback. But if you run 3 of these events, you also get enough data that you can quantify it and project it to the market, and have it be more than just the anecdotal. So it's that blend of quantitative and qualitative research that helps organizations make good decisions. So that wraps us up. And I'd like to invite the audience to ask additional questions. I'm going to start with one while we wait for anyone to type in others. But we've talked so much about the board's role in strategic planning and the importance of it. Have either of you seen occasions where the board actually derailed the strategic planning? And if so, what would you recommend to those with us today? Like, how would you avoid that? Or how do you put rails on the process? Diane, you laughed when I said that. Should something else come to mind?
I think rails is a really good word, because I think guardrails are sometimes an effective use of getting a board to a general understanding of where they are all together. So, I'm thinking back to an organization, a Jewish organization, that was really trying to figure out what the body of options that they had were, including, are they only serving the Jewish community? Are they serving the broader community? And so we came up with this, list of guardrails. Like, what were the things that, they were going to stay within this parameter? I think that's an example of one of the most important things to make sure you don't have a board derail things is to bring them along on the journey. And I love the examples that you gave of the data, because I think that's the other thing that I've seen derails conversations with boards, is there's all this anecdotal information. And we all have those board members that are very outspoken, can throw something anecdotal out and the whole conversation shifts, or something gets scrapped because of it. And I think having data, and then to your point, making sure it's accessible to keep using it, is just so important. And I think the final thing I'll say is, again, I think very much about vision and strategic frameworks, and that's all about getting everybody on the same page about where we're heading. And then you can kind of figure out the in between. But if you're not in alignment about where you're heading, I think that's when you're more likely to get that derailment to happen. I don't know, Tad, what you've seen.
I totally agree. I've seen the process get derailed when they didn't have the consensus on the front end. And I think that's just crucial. I mean, to outline kind of, where you're headed, or with respect to the process. So that's my advice, is that build that consensus on the front end. Then it's fine to delegate to different groups or do things. But when I've seen it derail before, it was that the board felt like they didn't have as much participation in the process as they would have liked.
Yeah, and one of my reasons for bringing up that question was I have my own answer to it. After we kicked off all the discussions, planning for this, just a couple of weeks ago, I got a call from a CEO who will remain unidentified for rather obvious reasons as I go forward here. But he was really frustrated and said it was time for him to find another opportunity, and wanted me to keep my eyes and ears out for something that might be appropriate for him. And in that particular case, it was because some residents had backdoored leadership and gone to the board and complained about a certain direction that strategic planning was taking. And of course, that's a challenge, because while we absolutely have to consider our residents as we plan for the future, we're not designing for today's residents. We're planning for tomorrow's. And so that requires different thinking. And, the board and leadership had worked through this plan, had really gotten ready to launch. And then suddenly residents backdoored, went to the board chair came back and said, oh, we don't want to do this anymore. And it just, it derailed all of the work that had been done up to that point. So
Rob, I was involved similarly. I was asked to come into an organization. That same thing happened, and it ended up in the CEO resigning. The new CEO came in and asked me to help kind of repair the damage that was done with the residents. But the process that they did not only brought the board along, but brought all the key resident players along, because they were such an influence on the rest of the organization and the rest of the residents. So they knew that that literally could happen again if they weren't really careful about how to bring everybody along. So
yeah. And I'm going to go backwards for a second, but I meant to sort of close out that story of, you know, the information needed, and just say today, almost 10 years later, you know, that community, it did expand independent living. It did address its mix of things. It did update all of the amenity spaces. It's, I think, wrapping up, rebuilding, you know, all the nursing areas into, you know, neighborhood type settings. It's really a total transformation of that community. And yes, it takes 10 years from the time you start thinking about this until it gets all the way done, but it's been hugely successful, and they've stayed, you know, close to full. The expansion sold out like in 2 months. So, you know, that thought process, that guidance with a clear end goal, you know, truly can transform a community. So we have another question here. And again, we encourage anyone still with us today to share any questions before we wrap up here. But Diane, I'll direct this to you first, because this is a lot of what you do is work with organizations on developing and implementing plans. But, you know, what have you seen some effective ways that board level strategic planning happens? You know, is it like you come together for a day or a day and a half and this intensive planning process and you walk away with a strategic plan? Or is it more effective, you know, to do this planning over a longer period of time? Maybe, as in the question here, it says, maybe a series of half days over 6 months, or is it something different? How would you typically approach that planning process if you were leading an organization through this?
yeah, so it depends, obviously, but what I have found to be most helpful is there's almost always kind of an underlying things that everybody knows about an organization. And I think, particularly as somebody who's coming in from the outside to help an organization, it's quickly uncovering what the biggest issues are that the organization is facing, and addressing those. And while that may sound really obvious, it's amazing how many times people will get together at a strategic planning retreat and you walk away with all these pie in the sky ideas and stuff, and you're not dealing with the root of the issue. So I would say a strategic planning process is probably about a 4-month process. I don't think you want it to go much farther than that. I always start out by actually individually interviewing board members and just finding out where they're all at, because for 2 reasons. One, you're really, as Tad mentioned, you're really working to develop alignment with this board, and boards are people too, right? So not everybody's going to sit there and tell you what they think in the middle of a board meeting. Some people just don't necessarily operate like that. So I think understanding where all your board members are at, because what that usually does is you're going to come out with 3 or 4 major themes that are on the whole board's mind. Some of them they agree on, some of them they don't. What that does, in my opinion, is it kind of cuts to the chase. If there's stuff we're already agreeing on, CEO can, you know, really start to work on that and develop some strategies around it. And then you focus on your time on things that maybe the board doesn't understand or doesn't agree on. And sometimes those things start with the very foundation, like mission, and a lot of Jewish organizations right now and other faith-based are really wrestling with who do they serve. So I think that's one category. I think in the answer of, you know, how do you do it? I definitely think you take these big issues, these big themes. And yeah, you do probably a day and a half retreat to kick things off. And most importantly, to give people time to really think and digest together. And then I always think that then there's a smaller group that works on it. They keep bringing it back to the board and, testing concepts and having discussions. And then at the end of the day, it's always part of a board. It's always part of their generative work going forward. It is not a one and done.
Ed, did you
Okay.
have something you'd like to add to that?
No, I think that
Nope.
was well stated.
All right, good. Thank you. Well, we don't have any other live questions right now, so we'd like to thank our audience again for joining us today. I hope this is helpful for you, and especially would like to thank Diane and Tad again for their time, their thoughts, contributing to blogs that have accompanied this and the webinar. We will have a recording of this be sent out to everyone who was registered for today. So we do encourage you, please share it with others in your organizations, and we hope it's helpful. So thank you again, everyone, and take care.